All right, so we finished off by talking about, you know, basically how the federal government was really kind of giving rights and some things that it was protecting and some things it wasn't. Particularly, we said that it kind of protected the slave trade for a while. It really kind of helped out with that, but it also, you know, all these rights and compromises led to the system that we really use today, and which is very, very important when you look at just how much of our system came out of those early debates about what our federal government should look like, what are the real responsibilities of our federal government. And it's really interesting to kind of take that into account. Now, another major debate when we talked about the idea of the financial systems and some of the problems that took place with those, where the farmers and the states were in debt, but the states kind of sided with the lenders because the lenders owned all the debt and they were going to take stuff from the states, so the states were kind of trapped, and the federal government couldn't levy taxes or raise money and didn't have any control over the financial policies. So this was a major thing that the Articles of Confederation failed to do, but the Constitution kind of allowed the federal government to expand, but nobody really knew how that was going to play out. So that brings us to this guy named Alexander Hamilton. Now, George Washington, he gets elected the first president. Everybody's aware of that, right? Okay. And so when he goes to select his cabinet, now we think of like the federal government and the president's cabinet being like a huge thing now. Like hundreds of thousands of people work directly for the executive branch. But when George Washington got elected, his cabinet consisted of two people. Well, three people. He had a secretary. He had a secretary of Treasury, like a personal like secretary that like took notes. A secretary of Treasury and a secretary of State, and then he had a vice president. Okay? That was it. That was the whole, like, basically the entire executive branch was four dudes from the very beginning. And so he goes and selects his cabinet. And, you know, there's a lot of tensions about what the size and the scope of the federal government should be. And these early appointees are really going to have a lot of influence on what the government's going to look like in the future. So the vice president was actually John Adams. Initially, in the Constitution, the vice president was selected as the person who got second in the election. So whoever got the second most electoral college votes became the vice president. Which, how weird would that be today? Can y'all imagine if Joe Biden was president and Donald Trump was vice president? Oh my gosh, that would be so much better. But or if Donald Trump had been president and Hillary Clinton had been vice president, son, craziness. I didn't choose her, all right? It's in the Constitution. Not saying it's a great choice, but we're going to go by America's Constitution. But I'm going to make her have the worst jobs ever. So he picks Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of Treasury. Now, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they both want a very active government that's going to promote prosperity by supporting American industry and stuff like that. But in order to kind of balance it out, Washington, who's a really good politician, honestly, selects Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. And Jefferson was very committed to restricting federal power. And he wanted to preserve an economy that was kind of based on agriculture and kind of keep America to its roots. And so almost from the very beginning, Washington really struggled to kind of reconcile what becomes known as Federalists and Republicans, okay? And even within his own administration. Alexander Hamilton believed that self-interest was the most powerful incentive of human actions. So what makes people do what they do? They do it in self-interest, all right? It drives humans to accumulate property, and that effort creates commerce and industry. According to Hamilton, government had important roles to play in this process. First, he said the state should protect private property from theft. And secondly, according to Hamilton, the state should use human passions and make them subservient to the public good. In other words, a wise government could harness its citizens' desire for property so that private individuals and the government would both benefit. Now, Hamilton, like a lot of his contemporary statesmen, did not believe that the federal government should ensure an equal distribution of property. He didn't think that it was the government's job to make sure everybody had property. Inequality was understood as the great and fundamental distinction in society. And Hamilton really didn't see a reason why that should change. Instead, Hamilton wanted to basically tie the economic interests of the wealthiest Americans, or the money men, to the federal government's financial health. So basically he said, if I can make the rich people care about whether or not the government survives, then the government's more likely to survive. Because rich people are going to act out of self-interest, and if they have all the money, and I force them to basically be tied to the federal government, then they'll find a way to make sure we don't go bankrupt and fail. Which is kind of true. He said if the rich needed the government, they would direct their energies to make sure that it remained solvent. Hamilton therefore believed that the federal government must be basically a repository of the rights of the wealthy. And so the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, he proposed a very ambitious financial plan to achieve that. So you need to know for quiz and test purposes what the two major parts of Hamilton's plan was. All right? The first part of his plan involved something called federal assumption of state debt, which basically was mostly like leftover debt from the Revolutionary War. It totaled about $25 million, all the states combined. And he said that the federal government should basically say, hey, states, I know each of you individually owe all of this money, but the federal government is basically going to buy it from you. Which means the federal government is going to pay you so that you can pay off the debt, and then you owe the federal government. So we assume the debt. Secondly, Hamilton wanted to create a bank. In fact, not just any bank, but a Bank of the United States. Now, the goal of these proposals was to basically link federal power and the country's economic vitality. Under the assumption proposal, the state's creditors, the people who owed, state bonds or promissory notes, would basically, that the states owed those. So basically during the Revolutionary War, they would come to a rich person and go, hey, look, we need to go buy 100 guns. It's going to be $5,000. You give us $5,000, we'll give you a piece of paper that says we'll pay you back with interest at the end of the war. And at the end of the war, when we get our stuff back together, you can come up and take $5,000 with interest, or we'll have to give you like property or something in equal value. So you've got all these people that have all these old notes. Well, basically he said, you can bring those to the federal government and we'll give you new federal money in place of those state monies. All right? Now, this people really disagreed with. Okay? They did not like it. And the reason they didn't like it was because they didn't think that the federal government should give a full value to these old state notes, which had actually gone down in value. They depreciated because the economy had bottomed out. So what was worth $5,000 when they got the note was now only really worth like $2,000. Hamilton's plan said, no, we're going to give them the full $5,000. And people were like, well, that's stupid. Why are we doing that? We should just give them what it's worth now. He said, no. If you do that, then nobody will ever trust the government ever again. You have to give them what it's worth. I kind of agree with that, right? The second thing that people really found controversial about this is, and I think we're kind of dealing with this right now in today's society. It's a different issue, but it's happening right now. There were a lot of southern states, remember, that's where all the money was. The agricultural food money was in the southern states. They had lots of wealthy plantation owners. They already paid back their debt. They had already paid back their state debts. So when they look at this and they go, wait a minute, wait. We paid back our debt, And now you're basically going to just give away money to the people who didn't do the right thing and didn't pay their debt back, and we have to pay for it through federal taxes. So even though we did the right thing and paid back what we owed, and they didn't, we basically are going to have to pay taxes to pay for them not doing what they were supposed to do? Does that sound familiar? No? It's the exact same debate people are having about student loan forgiveness right now. It's the exact same debate. People that have paid back their student loans already, who got out of college and said, hey, I owe this money. I'm going to pay it back as soon as I can because I don't want to have to pay it back over 30 years. Like me and my wife, we paid back our student loans. Within 10 years of being out of college, we both paid back all of our student loans, like 60 grand, 50, 60 grand of student loans. We paid them all back. And then he comes out and says, oh, we're going to forgive all these student loan debts. But if you already paid yours back, that's just too bad. How do you forgive them? Well, we're going to make your tax money go to pay off their debt. I'm sitting here going, well, wait a minute. I did what I was supposed to do. I paid with my money. Now people who just didn't do what they were supposed to do, I have to pay with my money to pay theirs off too? It's the same debate, right? If you think about it. And so that was a big thing there. Now, Washington and Congress, George Washington basically said, you know what? We hear what you're saying, but we're going to accept Hamilton's argument. And by the end of 1794, 98% of the country's domestic debt had been converted into these new federal bonds. Okay? The Bank of the United States also got congressional approval, despite the fact that there was some pretty strong opposition to it. You might need to remember that for quiz and test purposes, that it was, approved, but there was some very strong opposition to it. Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans argued that the plan was unconstitutional and that it didn't authorize Congress to create a bank, but Hamilton said, actually, it's not only constitutional, but it's important for the prosperity of America. He said it would fulfill several needs. It would act as a convenient depository for federal funds. It would print paper banknotes that was backed by specie, which is like gold or silver, so silver and gold-backed currency. It would also help control inflation by sometimes taking currency out of circulation, right? It would limit the number of notes the state banks printed, and it would give wealthy people a vested interest in the federal government's finances, because the federal government, even though it's the Bank of the United States, the federal government only owned 20% of it. The other 80% was owned by wealthy individuals. So they were invested in making sure it succeeded, because if it failed, they would lose all their money. Makes sense. In 1791, however, so Congress approves a 20-year charter for the Bank of the United States. The bank's stocks, together with other federal bonds, create about $70 million in new financial instruments. It creates the formation of security markets. It allows the federal government to borrow money and underwrite, the spread of state-chartered banks so that businesses and corporations can continue to grow and expand and create a better economy base. For the Federalists, this was a major purpose of the federal government. But the Republicans, who were their opponents for quiz and test purposes, remember why they opposed it. They said that they believed that there should be a more limited role of the government in industry, and that people who lived out in the frontier, they didn't have access to all this money. So basically, Hamilton's system basically just reinforced the class boundaries between those who already were wealthy and those who weren't. And the ones who were wealthy had more say in the government. Furthermore, Hamilton's plan had another major problem, which was that how are you going to pay for all of this? The government didn't have any money. So how are they going to afford to buy all these people's debt and create $70 million in currency? They're going to have to tax you, because the government's going to have to start raising revenue somehow. So they're going to do some taxing. Hamilton says, well, the easiest way to do that is something called an excise tax, which is where you tax, like, basically all levels of a product. And he does this on several products, but one of the major ones that he does this on is the production, sale, and consumption of whiskey. And that's going to be a problem, okay? Because people like whiskey, like a lot. All right?